So let's take a look at the same example of this ball moving in an arc, and this one has an ease in and an ease out applied to it. And you can see that it does actually look a lot more natural. It looks a bit like a pendulum swinging from one side to the other. What's happening here is that this ball leaves this keyframe and it slows out of this keyframe. So it takes the drawings are spaced closer together. And remember, as I showed you, drawings that are spaced closer together will appear to slow things down. Then it speeds up because there are fewer drawings in this section, and then it starts to slow down into the final pose. That's essentially what an ease in or ease out is. So I'm going to explain each part of this pendulum separately, and as you saw in the last video, when you do in between for constant speed and even motion, you use that method of halves that I showed you. You break your timeline down into half and work back towards the first keyframe and forwards towards the last keyframe. It's pretty much the same for ease in and out, but you assign your drawings to your frames a little bit differently, and I'll show you what I mean by that. Let's look at an ease out of a keyframe first. What you'll do is you'll determine the halfway point between your two key drawings, but then you give that drawing to your last in-between on your timeline. So that halfway point drawing actually goes at the very end of the in-betweens, close to the second key. So now, with onion skin turned on, you can see that I've got my first drawing and my last drawing, and then my middle point drawing is in between these two drawings, but it's actually assigned to this very last in-between down here on my timeline. So then I'm going to step back one and create a new keyframe, drag my drawing to the halfway position now between those two drawings. Now I step back a frame, create a new keyframe, and assign that to the halfway point between those two drawings. So as you can see, I'm working backwards. For an ease out of a key pose, you can in between by working backwards. It'll all make sense in a minute. I'm just going to finish filling in these drawings. I'm just basically stepping back one, creating a keyframe, and dragging the drawing into the halfway point. You'll see that the spacing becomes incrementally smaller and smaller right up until the very last keyframe. And then when I hit play, turn off onion skinning, you can see how it slows out of that first keyframe and then speeds up into the very last keyframe. That's your easing out of a key. Let's do an easing into a key, and it is the same process except going the other way. We will now work forwards instead of working backwards. So I'm going to create a new layer and hide this one and start over again just to make sure that you can see the process. So in my first frame, my first keyframe will make my starting drawing. My last keyframe, drag that into position. And now this is an ease in. So I want my drawings to slow down and ease into this keyframe. So I'm going to go to my start and step 2 frames ahead and create a new keyframe there. Turn on onion skinning and drag it out so I can see my starting and ending position. And then drag that drawing to the halfway point. So halfway between those two. And now step ahead one, create a new keyframe, drag my drawing to the halfway point between those two frames. Step ahead, create a keyframe, drag my drawing across. And then I'm just going to continue the process. It's very evenly spaced, but again, as you will notice, the space itself is becoming incrementally smaller and smaller as I get closer to the final key. Got to be careful to really find that halfway mark. It's much easier obviously with a circle because you can see it's very easy to spot that the halfway point between the two drawings. For the very last two in-betweens, I'm actually just going to use my arrow keys to nudge the drawing into place. And those are those on my keyboard, the bottom right. The right arrow nudges it forward just slightly. Then I'll turn off onion skinning, and if you hit enter, you'll notice how it shoots out of that first frame and slows into the last. And that's a slow into a key pose. Now the last thing that I want to tell you about input reading is when to use it. Right, so let's say you have an object that moves on screen from here to here. So the motion happens on screen. We see the object starting and stopping. Then you would use a slow in and slow out, much like that pendulum that I showed you. If you have an object that starts off screen, travels across the screen and goes off screen again, then you would use a constant even speed because we don't see the start and stop positions. And if you've got an object that starts moving on screen and moves off and then travels off the screen completely, I would use a slow out of that first pose and then just let it travel off screen. And similarly, if something starts off screen and comes in and stops, then I would use a slow in to that final key pose.